Hey, Margie here. Did you know there's genetic testing that can tell you if you have the genes that predispose you to various inflammatory conditions, as well as issues with vitamin D absorption? That's the topic we're delving into today with our very special guest, Dr. Sam Shay. And Dr. Shay is a chiropractor who's dedicated his life to helping others through functional medicine and functional genetics. He has recently authored a new ebook on genetics where he goes into how your genes affect vitamin D absorption, immunity support, and so much more. In today's talk, we really get into what can be learned from genetic testing and how to use this information to improve your bones and overall health. We even discuss a great exercise that Dr. Shay learned from a practitioner who worked with the astronauts to help bone density. So it's filled with lots of great information, so stay tuned. Welcome, Dr. Sam. I am really, really thrilled to have you today on the podcast. And we're going to have a lot of fun. But before we even get started, I love the fact that besides being a functional medicine practitioner, you are a stand-up comic and you do stand-up comedy. So I always like to know the backstory, and I will get to the backstory on how you got involved with genetics. But please tell us. I think everyone wants to know, how did you get into stand-up comedy? And
Sure. I'm aware of your podcast. You do bone health and happiness. So listeners say get 2 for 1. What a deal, And I've always been interested in comedy. I actually started as a child. Now, before anyone knew any better, and before his meteoric fall from grace, I watched Bill Cosby. This is back in the 80s. And so I practically memorized his 1980s special, Bill Cosby himself. I'm like 8, 9 years old. I'm just quoting, like, just keep going, just keep repeating it. And so I loved comedy. And one of the reasons I got into comedy is that growing up, it was not a very happy experience. I had a lot of emotional stress at home with my mother and father had a nuclear divorce when I was 6 years old, and me and my sisters were caught in the blast radius, and it was a really terrible, highly formative experience. And so many things developed as a result from that divorce, the high levels of stress at home and the high levels of stress and unfortunately a lot of violence at school and humiliation at school, and none of the adults in the room or community or my parents stepped in to stop. So I had emotional turmoil at home, physical and emotional turmoil at school. So my escape was sugar and the screens. And so I developed a sugar and video game addiction and a screen addiction. And comedy was a way that I could actually experience something resembling joy amidst a very harrowing period of my life, which was highly, the formative years of my life. And I just kept watching comedy. I mean, I know, and it's kind of a hard landing to go from stand-up comedy to like physical trauma at school. Like I know maybe kind of abrupt, but that's just the reality of the trajectory I've been on. And when I continued comedy when I was in chiropractic school, we had talent shows, and I did not stand-up comedy, but sit-down comedy, where I pretended to be Jon Stewart. Like I put on a 3-piece suit in the auditorium facing, hundreds and hundreds of people with a little auditorium screen, was that little news box that hovers to the right, on the comedy news shows. And I just gave deadpan comedy, but have the screens be all the really hilarious stuff to contrast it. And it was a lot of fun. I found comedy to be fun, cathartic, and therapeutic. Comedy is a way to deliver truth in a more palatable medium. And comedy is also a way to deliver truth in a way that it's not even just palatable. It's one of it can be a double-edged sword. It could be one of the safest ways to deliver a piece of truth in a situation to a person that would otherwise be not ready to receive it. And it could also backfire, where the person can retaliate from hearing something in a joke. So it's a very delicate it's a very, very delicate balance using humor, as we know, because now there's now stand-up comics that simply, like Jerry Seinfeld, whose comedy is so clean you could practically clean your teeth with it. You know, he doesn't go to college campuses anymore because they're accusing him of all sorts of whatever. I mean, he and a bunch of other comics who simply don't perform at colleges anymore because now the colleges are a hostile environment to comedy. And actually, for our listeners, like when societies start jailing comics, that is the time to leave. That is the time to leave. The court jester is the canary in the coal mine. And I use comedy right now. When I'm in sessions with people, with my clients, I really do my best to be as engaging and humorous as possible without minimizing or trivializing the nature of the content we're discussing. And the reason why has to do with the placebo effect, that being likable is actually a clinical imperative. And what I mean by that is there was I think it was 2019, maybe 2020, I can't remember. There was an article that described the placebo effect. It was in the New York Times, and it said that the placebo effect is how much you like and trust your doctor. And so, and that explains so much, because I've met truly profoundly mediocre clinicians, profoundly mediocre, who have disproportionately better results than that they should. And the reason, and all of them are so damn likable. They're funny, they're engaging, they're charming. And so what happens is that whenever you think of doing something this clinician recommends, whether it's a diet, an exercise, a supplement, a lifestyle change, there's a feeling of expansion and lightness because you like the person the recommendation is associated with. And then the reverse is true. I've met truly brilliant clinicians whose protocols just glow, just glowing protocols. And their clients do not get the results they should because the clinician has the personality of a doorstop or worse.
You know, that's really so funny that you're saying this, because I couldn't agree more. And I just, you know, as you know, I teach happiness, and happiness is always part of everything I do because I think it's so foundational. However, comedy is important, and to be able to laugh and look at jokes and watch jokes and laugh at funny movies, it changes lives. It changes your chemicals. And we'll talk about that. I mean, it changes everything. So I think having that background is amazing, but I have to just tell you something really funny. So you're saying that you, as a functional medicine practitioner and chiropractor, you know, use jokes with your patients. Well, my husband's an OBGYN, so he delivers babies, and women are in stirrups when, you know, in the position. So he loves jokes, but I always tell him they have to laugh. They're stuck, you know. So he uses that to get people calmed down prior to a, you know.
Calm down or increase the contractions?
No, when they're in the way now, well, both, I guess it can, you know, but okay. Yeah, but no, mostly just to relax and, you know, right. It's not, or new patients when they come to see him, it's, you know, it's not the most comfortable position or comfortable exam or something people are looking forward to. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. And I love the idea of your jokes and having that background of a comedian is just fabulous.
Yeah, and just to clarify, like there's multiple different types of comedians. Like there's a great there's Keegan Michael Key of Key and Peele. He did an 11-part series on Audible on the history of sketch comedy. And if people are interested in the history of sketch comedy, he goes back to like the first written joke from the Sumerians that's been documented like 1800 BCE or something like that. And if people are interested in comedy and the evolution of jokes, I'd highly encourage that series. One of the things, like back in the early 1900s, when we had this, you know, very, you know, waves of immigration coming into New York City, we had the rise of slapstick. And the reason why is because there were so many languages that you couldn't stand up and tell a joke in one language because there were so many, but you could do physical humor. So this is like the Three Stooges a lot of their humor was physical because, and I think they were I'm maybe butchering this, but they were probably the inspiration for like Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry, like all the physical humor, even though it looks, from our standards today, very violent. Humor evolves and is a reflection of the culture and a critique of the culture as well. So back to the clinician who had the personality of a doorstop or worse, whenever a client thinks of a protocol recommendation or that's from a practitioner they don't like, they have a cortisol response. So their level of progress from the protocol they were given is not going to hit a cortisol tinged glass ceiling. And that's the nocebo effect. So being likable is actually a clinical imperative for the benefit of the client. Otherwise, the protocols you're doing are going to have less of an effect as they should. So when I read this article, I then enrolled in a stand-up comedy and improv comedy class formally. I'd done one other one back in New Zealand, but I'm doing them regularly each year. So my hope is that we can take something as medically mundane as bone density and make it enjoyable, at least, as opposed to just academic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the fun thing. Everybody listening, there's actual research on cortisol, the stress hormone, how that reduces the osteoblast, the bone building cells. So there's a huge correlation. So think we ended now, we haven't even started into functional genetics. If we just ended now and you laughed more, added some comedy.
I win. Do I get a plaque? Do I get a bone density shaped plaque?
And then happiness also, when people are happier, it increases their bone density as well. There's been correlations, but okay, so this has been really fun. So let's go to what you really have a specialty in terms of, and I think we haven't brought this up at all on the podcast. And I think it's such an important topic, functional genetics, and then we'll relate it to bones. And so tell us how you got into that first and what it is exactly.
I'll throw one last asterisk on the comedy and then leap back into bones. If people want to see some of my stand-up comedy bits, you can just go to my YouTube channel. Just put in Dr. Sam Shay into YouTube. I have a playlist of a couple stand-up comedy clips. If you like David Attenborough for National Geographic, I pretend to be David Attenborough narrating a National Geographic special inside a Boulder coffee shop.
You know what I'll do? I'll put the link in the show notes to your comedy routine, so they could just click it as well.
If you want to see a humorous rendition of David Attenborough, you'll die laughing. Anyway, so how I got into functional genetics. So tying back to what I said originally about my history of having a very difficult upbringing, aside from developing a sugar and a screen addiction, I also developed a coffee habit. I had a terrible diet. I had severe digestive problems, crippling insomnia to the point where it stunted my growth. I had severe insomnia from 6 to 18, and I should be 4 inches taller than I am right now based on a number of factors, biometrics and the statistical data, etc. And depression, anxiety, chronic pain from the injuries from the violence, as well as sitting all day at school and in front of screens. And it was not good. And I decided as a teenager to take control of my life, take control of my health. And I got started by reading natural health books. I found a mentor who started doing brain gym, which is a form of kinesiology, with me, and helped me kind of reshape my thinking and help my body's relationship to my mind. And then I got into college and did a glorified pre-med, a holistic health practitioner degree in the evenings and weekends, got into meditation and yoga and other stuff. And then just kind of progressed from there. And when I was in chiropractic school, I got really heavy into neurology, really deep into functional neurology, nutrition. And then this whole time I'm trying to figure out what was still recovering from, those first 16, 18 years of poor health. And I'm trying to put everything together. And I finally get into practice. I'm in New Zealand. And I have a model called the 10 pillars of health. And then I developed this model looking at 10 specific pillars: brain and hormones, bowel and digestion, body structure, injuries. I put genetics in there. Fourth pillar is burst movement and exercise. Fifth pillar is biotoxins and toxicity in general. Pillar number 6 is bionutrients and nutrition. Pillar 7 is breakfast and routines. Pillar 8 is bothers and stressors. Pillar 9 is bugs and hidden infections. Pillar 10 is bedtime or sleep. So brain, bowel, body, burst, biotoxins, bionutrients, breakfast, bothers, bugs, bedtime. That's
lots of B's, right?
lots of B's. And I have an ebook specifically devoted to that. It's not the nature of this discussion we're having today, but I have an ebook on my website. Is drsamshay.com /biohacker, because the ebook's called Biohack Your Biohacking, Common Sense Guide to Functional Medicine and Functional Testing. But you just go to my website, drsamshay.com, at drsamshay.com for those listening. There's a separate ebook just on that. And the reason why it's relevant to genetics is that I'd really gotten into the 10 pillars, helping people with all sorts of chronic things, figuring out that people were struggling with chronic issues at a minimum 7 out of 10 pillars crumbling, which explained why they were jumping from one practitioner, one protocol, and one product to the next and not really getting any results, because most of those things are dealing with 1 to 3 pillars, not 7 plus at a time. And like if you're just sitting on 7 tacks and you remove 3 of them, are you technically healthier? Technically, yes, but do you feel any better? Not really. So it explained how there was a multiplicity of factors that had to be addressed kind of synergistically to deal with whatever people were struggling with. And in 2015, I was introduced to functional genetics. And this was the missing piece, one of the missing pieces that I hadn't really gotten properly exposed to. So there's medical genetics, and then there's functional genetics. And the difference is the difference is that, in fact, let me share my I have a slide on this that I can
okay, so for those of you, so for anybody watching on YouTube, you can watch this, and otherwise just explain it so those who are
absolutely
who are listening can also understand what we're doing.
Yeah. So what we have here is, like, this is the 2 models of healthcare. So one is the Western medical and one is the aligned healthcare or natural or functional healthcare model. And just to be clear, like, I'm not like, I really like really competent, skilled Western medical practitioners. It's just that the philosophy is different from functional medicine or natural medicine. So Western medicine came out of military medicine, triage, where someone had, an emergency situation that needed to be stabilized. They didn't have missing arm disease or bleeding eye syndrome. That doesn't make any sense. It was an emergency thing that needs to be stabilized. And the problem with that philosophy is that when you apply it to a non-crisis situation, and that's what we have today, where everything is either a crisis or it's not bad enough to be a crisis. Stop complaining, go home, take some psychiatric meds. So it's a matter of, like, the Western medicine philosophy is really like the fire department. If they get there in time and don't screw up, they can save the life of the house by hosing it down and chopping down windows, walls, doors, etc. And the analogy of the water is medication, and chopping things down with axes is surgery. But what's left afterwards is you need a lot of repair, and you wouldn't call the fire department a week later just to hose it down and chop out another wall to make it livable. You call a general contractor, which would be someone in this metaphors would be someone like me, someone who does the functional assessments to look at all the different parts, the 10 different pillars for this house, in order to put it back together, make it livable, and then ideally optimal. So we've got crisis. So you've got these 2 different models, one crisis, one prevention. One's about population statistics, one's about precision, dealing with the person in front of you. One is mechanistic, one is holistic. One works with symptoms, one works with the root, etc. And that applies also to genetics, because in the traditional model, it's also based off of, philosophically, like, there's one cause, one issue, like germ theory. And they've applied the same philosophy of germ theory to gene theory, where there's one gene causing one disease. That's thankfully moving away from that kind of siloed perspective. And Western genetics is, we got to find the Alzheimer's gene, the diabetes gene, the osteoporosis gene, the cancer gene, the heart disease gene, the stroke gene. Like we've got to find the gene or the couple of genes that are responsible, like one germ causes one disease, and we got to find that gene and target it. Whereas functional genetics, the genetics that I learned and now teach and lecture on and have written an ebook on and help clients with, is we look at clusters of genes that control all the processes like inflammation, that when they go awry, when inflammation goes amok, then the inflammatory genes are above the specific quote unquote disease genes. If you have too much inflammation that's gone awry, and you're genetically vulnerable to provoking and overstimulating and overpropagating inflammation or underquenching it, then the inflammation will poke on the quote unquote disease genes, the osteoporosis gene, the stroke gene, the heart disease gene, the diabetes gene, etc. So functional genetics is looking at the clusters of genes that control or are the drivers of all the disease genes underneath it. So looking at inflammation, free radical damage, liver detox, vitamin D utilization, methylation, cardiovascular circulation, fat energy metabolism. So we're not looking for diseases, we're looking for those drivers. And that's what functional genetics is. Additionally, there's some other fun tests they have, like how to genetically determine your optimal diet in terms of carb tolerance, that you can now genetically determine, are you a keto, paleo, Mediterranean, or high carb? That's really pivotal. I mean, that was absolutely critical to my journey in genetics, because I was teaching diet, 15 years at that point, and I was still having some really embarrassing digestive problems, and I couldn't figure out why, because I had the most Portlandia diet like ever. Knew the names of the chickens, knew the farmers, knew all that, and I was still having digestive problems. And then when I did my genetics tests, it didn't matter how organic and sprouted my quinoa was, hand-picked by left-handed monks and all the rest of it. Didn't matter if it was soaked in pure spring water. Irrelevant. I was still getting really bad digestive problems. But when I did my genetics test, I actually found out I was the second lowest carb tolerance you can have. It wasn't a quality of carbs issue, it was a quantity of carbs. And within 1 week of changing my diet to match my genetic tolerance for carbohydrates, my digestive problems went away. And I was struggling with those digestive problems for 20 years. So,
wow. Can we just stop for 1 minute?
sure.
Because this is, I think everybody's listening thinking, oh my goodness, this sounds absolutely amazing. And so because a lot of people have just never even heard of, it's not something when they go to the doctor and they have bone loss that they're told, oh, let's check your genes. So can we maybe really explain what they could find out and what might be important for our bones? Do you want to do it? Do you want to do it here, or do you want to finish what you're talking about?
No, it's a direct connection into what you're talking about.
Okay.
Let's talk about, as genes relate to bones. Okay. So genes are fixed.
Should we change the slide for a minute?
Yeah, we'll change it. So genes are fixed, but they're flexible. So what that means is that you can be born, like I was, with a lot of genetic vulnerabilities to poor health. And in fact, when I got my first gene test, I frankly just burst into tears, because I realized why I was so ill while everyone else supposedly wasn't, or at least from my eyes, because I had such I had such bad genes that I was the one who everything was expressed. All the disease genes were being expressed. And then I realized once I had my gene results, I also then cried, because I knew what to do, because now I had the lifestyle recommendations based on the genes to correct course. So when genes are fixed but flexible, what that means is that you may have certain vulnerabilities in your genes to be more propensity towards osteoporosis and low bone density. So for example, there's certain inflammatory genes called like interleukin interleukin 1, like interleukin 1A. I mean, you can get really nerdy if you want, like interleukin 1A-1, interleukin 1A-2, interleukin 6. Like if you have these genes as what are called variants, like they're the less good versions of these genes, like the so-called yellow and red dots, that you're more likely to develop low bone density. But it doesn't mean you're doomed to develop low bone density. Only if you have a poor environment or lifestyle, wittingly or unwittingly, will then the low bone density manifest. It's like genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger, which is a very common metaphor. And if you have a poor lifestyle and an unfortunate set of genes, then the disease process will start to manifest. And the good news is that if you know which genes you have that are vulnerable, and you then know what lifestyle recommendations to put into play, you will then minimize the risk of having those disease genes later on expressed, because you're not provoking the genes upstream from getting inflamed or careening into a bad expression you don't want to experience.
So let's just take this, be devil's advocate for a minute. So what about the person that says, look, I eat clean, I exercise, I meditate, someone who's already doing good lifestyle, how is it going to help them? I mean, I know there's some specific ones with osteoporosis that could really make a big difference in terms of their, even further factors with absorption and vitamin D. And, so the person listening saying, oh, well, I do everything. Why do I need to know this?
Because unless they are a professional who's just does this every day for years and is in constant education and goes to seminars and is on summits and podcasts and reads and all these other things, knowledge doubles every 2 years. So they may know a lot now, but they're not going to know as much as they think they know in at least 2 years' time. And there's all sorts of new things coming out that can make whatever they're doing at a minimum more efficient, more effective, easier to do, less expensive overall, or just more specific to what they specifically need to do. There's also plenty of things that I've seen in the genetics reports of recommendations of things people have never even heard of, like certain specific nutrients that are, I don't know, worth what, 40 points on the Scrabble board. They've got so many that they didn't realize were so effective for their specific genetic variants. So it's also going to help focus as a matter. One of the main things I see with genetics for people who come to do genetics, like there's a huge variety. Like people are into genetics. Just to be clear, the type of genetics I do is about the different drivers of disease. It's not like what percentage Irish you are. That's a whole separate genetic. That's genealogy. But when people come who've never really done health screening before, never done testing before, people who are concerned that are about, say, like their parents or grandparents or an aunt or an uncle that's got something that they're wanting to minimize their future expression of, like something they're afraid of, they've inherited something, a genetic risk factor. And then there's people who are aspirants, like that are just, I'm super healthy and I want to be optimal. And each of these people get very different experiences when running their genetics, because the level of where we start is different. For someone who's the aspirant, it's really about super fine tuning, getting very granular in a matter of emphasis of, you're doing really great in all these areas, but really you need to take 50% of your attention in this area and put it over here, because you're going to get more gains over here. Whereas the person who's really, really unwell, it's about foundation. Like what is like the 3 key things in your genetics that we can just get you started over these next several months to just really lay a solid foundation, the most important things you can do to start feeling better as quickly as possible, and leave all the granular stuff for way down the line, because it's going to be too overwhelming and diminishing returns. Whereas the aspirant, they're at that point already where they just are looking for the last granular things.
Interesting. So the thing is, with bones specifically, what have you seen? You know, doing all this testing, what have you and I think there's another good point, prevention. If you find out something early on, you're more predisposed, just like you said, then you can make sure while you're feeling, you know, when you're feeling okay before something's expressed. I mean, to me, the most exciting thing is that we have control, just like you said, you know, with the gun, we have control over what's expressed, which I think is just so exciting and so empowering. So what have you seen in terms of bone health?
Sure.
What's very common that you'll see, like some examples that when people,
So the examples, it's pretty straightforward and pretty complex at the same time. If you want just to think about how do I look at bone health in terms of genetics, you think, what do I look for in regards to inflammation and vitamin D receptors? So you look and I can, if you want me to get nerdy and name the genes, I can, but I think it from a big picture perspective, I'll show you an example on the slide. Like this is, this is an example of the top 15 inflammatory genes that are in this particular genetics report that I run. And the names and the details and the symbols are not relevant, you know, but it's the big picture. We look at, is there a problem with inflammation as such? And yes, certain genes of these 15 are more relevant to inflammation, osteoporosis, and bone density based on the research. And certain, but as a general rule, and we can go over those individuals if you want, but as a general rule, inflammation, the majority of these genes of these 15 have a role to play with bone density and inflammation, which affects bone density. So I'm looking for, is there a problem with inflammation as such? Not chasing one individual gene. I'm looking at the clusters of genes and then finding what is the single lifestyle or the couple lifestyle interventions that meaningfully change the genetic expression of 10 of these red and yellow dot genes, as opposed to giving 10 separate recommendations. Can I give 3 that will affect all 10, 3 separate ways? And so then genetics becomes very practical. What do? You do these handful of things that are going to affect all of the genes in question simultaneously from multiple different angles, as opposed to chasing one recommendation per gene, which just becomes crazy making. And that's what you see in things like 23andMe and Ancestry, and they put them through these, you know, app algorithms, and like they spit out 300 recommendations that aren't prioritized, aren't organized. They all seem equally valid, and it's overwhelming and scary, and people just give up. As opposed to like, okay, out of the 100 things you can do, here's the top 10 in exact order from 1 to 10.
I love that.
That's specific. And that's exactly what I do. It's like, what do you need to do in this order based on the science? Because all the recommendations are based on peer-reviewed papers done on humans, not wombats, not nematodes, that demonstrate lifestyle, diet, exercise, supplements alone can change the expression of the gene in question to behave better.
So now I love this. So we have inflammation, and can we talk about the vitamin D? Because that is something, you know, people like, why all of a sudden people's vitamin D level, because most people do get, and most doctors do ask for a vitamin D level. Like, I'm taking vitamin D, what's going on here? So there are people that are having issues with vitamin D, not realizing part of it could be due to genes. So why don't you fill us in on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the road, vitamin D is very complicated. I'll show you an example. I'll show you an example here. So there's 11 major genes that are required for getting vitamin D into the system, vitamin D into the blood from sunlight, and then ultimately into your system. Let me just expand this out here. Okay, so here we go. So here's an example. The 11 genes. So getting vitamin D from sunlight is actually difficult. You've got multiple genes involved, and then if you're overweight, then the precursor to true vitamin D gets stored in the fat cells. So even if you convert it into from sunlight in that first step, it can get siphoned off into the fat. Then your liver has to convert it, and then there's this transfer protein that has to bring it from the liver to the kidney, and then the kidney has to do a step, and then there's another gene that can, clear it out from the kidney, and then it can get into the blood. So, getting it from sunlight can be tricky for certain people. Then, even if it gets into the blood, then you have the issue of, does it get from the blood into the cells? That's what we want. It's not just getting vitamin D in the blood, it's getting it into the cells, into bone cells, into like every single cell in the body, except for red blood cells and dead skin cells, has a vitamin D receptor. This is how important it. Vitamin D is actually a misnomer. It's actually a hormone. It's not a vitamin. It was misnamed. So the key genes are the vitamin D receptors, the VDRs. Okay. And if you have variants in the VDR receptors, then you've got issues with absorbing vitamin D into the cells. And that's a real problem, because you can get all the vitamin D you want in the blood, but if it's not docking, like vitamin D floats in the blood, and then the cells have these little like catcher's mitts called receptors that just grab the vitamin D and then bring it into the cells to then do what it does. And vitamin D is estimated to control up to 5% of your entire genome. That's how important it is. It can affect up to 5%, 3 to 5%. I've seen the numbers of your entire genome. That's how important it is, which makes evolutionary sense, because we have, an enduring relationship with the sun, having as through the lens of evolution. So if you're going to be able to harness, harness that resource into your body, then you're going to have a result biochemically reflected in vitamin D and vitamin D receptors. So getting the vitamin D, identifying what I've seen here's something I've seen clinically. There's only been one case ever where I was working with someone who was chronically unwell that did not have double yellow or double red dots in their VDR genes. Every single other person I have ever worked with that was chronically unwell had a double yellow or a double red in their VDR genes.
So what you're saying is this is very common, or is it common with people who are just not well?
People who are not well, I'm a double red. Like people who are chronically unwell have, except for that one person, and she had another issue where it was a long time ago. I believe she had an acute toxic exposure, like an acute and enduring toxic exposure that overrode it. But she had another reason to be chronically unwell. But literally every other person I work with that's something, whether it's an autoimmune thing, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, digestive problems that weren't going away, inflammatory syndromes, whatever you want to think, it all had variant double yellows or double reds in vitamin D receptors, meaning that 5% of the genome was struggling. Because what does vitamin D do? It, in two major categories, that's most famous for is anti-inflammation and immune system regulation. So that was the connection that I made when looking just historically over all the tests I run relative to what people are experiencing.
Wow. So in terms of, I wonder what the connections with osteoporosis and those genes lighting up.
Well, osteoporosis, two of the genes related to osteoporosis is VDR and VDR2. There's for bone density, VDR and VDR2 are there for sure.
So the person finds out now that they have these genes, then what, and they're having this issue with vitamin D, what can they do?
So at the risk of, I will share what is recommended, but I really would caution people from just thinking, oh, I'm just going to go out and get this thing and it's going to be a magic bullet and everything's going to be great. It's not as simple as that. So when dealing with bone density and osteoporosis, it's not as simple as just getting some magic supplement and you're done. As you know, it has to be a full system assessment of what are the sources of inflammation? What are the sources of stress triggering cortisol? What's your lifestyle? What's your exercise? Are you doing, like the thump technique, or I called it the boom boom technique, but I learned it, you bounce off your heels a little to trigger Wolff's law to increase the osteoblastic activity, all that nerdy stuff.
Well, you know what?
So
Wait, because this is something that's amazing. And I teach this as well. We're going to deviate for half a second, not really deviating because this is a good thing for bone, but do you want to just repeat that? Because this is a phenomenal exercise you can do throughout the day, everybody.
sure. So I learned this in a Feldenkrais class just in Massachusetts. I was just going with my stepmother to this class, and the woman who taught it, I'm so sorry I can't remember her name, but she was talking. She's like literally the person NASA sent their astronauts to remineralize and reconstitute their bone density. And so I'm paying attention. Like I've got family members, my grandmother had osteoporosis. Like I'm absolutely paying attention. And what she did is she just stood up on the balls of her feet and then just let gravity take over. And she just kind of let her heels plop down on the ground. And there's called a boom boom, or she called the boom boom technique. I think you call it thump thump or something, or thumper. I don't remember. And then and you get that double thump because when the first heels strike, there's this little bounce off that naturally happens. And the reason why that works to help remineralize bone, it seems such a dorky, simple, almost bizarre exercise to remineralize your bone. The reason why it works has to do with a law of physiology called Wolff's law. Wolff's law states bone responds to the forces put upon it. That's why when astronauts are in space and there's no gravity, they come back with really low density bones because the body's efficient. It's like, well, bone's really expensive and dense and it has a turnover. So we're not going to waste resources if we don't need to have them dense because we're floating in a little bit of gravity. So there's there's nothing to impact against. So there's no reason for bones to be dense. So Wolff's law, when you go up on your balls of your feet and come down on your heels, you send a mild shock through your axial skeleton from your heels up to your head. And that mild shock is a force transduced through the entire axial skeleton that will then tell the body to put down bone, trigger osteoblastic activity because we've got a force going through our system. We need to get denser. The bones need to get stronger. So that's the scientific premise of that dorky technique that works.
It deviated, but here's the thing. I love that. And actually, I took a class from Gabby Alon, who has a program, Bones for Life. She was one of the Feldenkrais practitioners. What I do with that, I put one hand on the neck, one hand on the spine, just so the spine's in alignment. And you know what?
Yeah. Sure.
I'll attach. I have a video of that. I'll attach.
Yeah, please do. It really helped. This is one reason why walking is so important and not in squishy, shoes. Like you want to have zero lift shoes because then when you're walking, you're actually getting that force as opposed to being like walking on a little pillow, which is most people's cushy shoes.
So let's get back because I don't want to end without really giving people. So back to the vitamin D. So people they'll have to explain the test as well, but people find out they have these issues. So what they should do.
So for vitamin D, so specifically to vitamin D receptors, there's several things that have to be done. One is you avoid smoke and pollution because that suppresses the expression of the vitamin D receptors. So whether it's active smoking or passive smoking or pollution, that will suppress the expression. The other thing to get is something called sulforaphane, and it's a broccoli sprout extract. It's very complicated. It's not all products are legit because they only give a portion of it. It's very, very, they have to combine glucoraphanin with moracinase, and then I'll get you a sulforaphane. It's this whole complicated thing, and it's not easy to extract or stabilize. That's why this particular product can be on the more expensive side of the supplement spectrum. And it's why I only deal with practitioner level products because I know the quality and potency and purity is there. I don't mess around with what I can get out of Trader Joe's or Walmart or whatever other nonsense. So that's one particular product that has been shown to very effectively increase the expression of the VDR gene. And
can we just stop for a second? So if a person gets this and then they do the remedy, it could make a huge difference. This is something they had no idea even existed, but it could make a big difference in their bone health.
It could asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Like, what else are they doing in their
Of
lifestyle?
course, but this
What
could
else are they
be,
dropping? Like, yeah, it's a part of this. This is the danger of functional medicine, where people will, not that you're doing it, it's just that I'm just reemphasizing it from a point I made earlier. It's like the danger of functional medicine is we now apply the same philosophy of medication to natural supplements. And that's not what functional medicine is. It's not trading out pharmacy for supplements. That is not the point. The point is that supplements are exactly that, a supplement to what? Global lifestyle assessment and change, ideally based on functional testing, whether it's genetics testing, adrenal testing, mitochondrial testing, hormone testing, gut testing, whatever it is. We use data. I define functional medicine as the best of Western medicine diagnostics with the best of natural medicine, lifestyle, nutrition, and diet interventions. And sulforaphane is an example of a small tool that could have a big effect as long as it's within the ecosystem of proper lifestyle, proper diet, proper assessments with labs under supervision of a trained expert.
yeah, I
And
love that. That's great.
so that's kind of the long and the short of it for the VDRs. The VDRs have, unfortunately, very few things can really help them in relative to all the other genes that we know of. There'll be more research coming out on them. I mean, we saw in the year of COVID, vitamin D got a lot of deserved fanfare, and all the genes associated with it also got a bump in the research capital. So we'll probably see a couple more findings on VDRs in the next couple of years. Again, another reason to stay in touch with a trained professional as opposed to thinking that, oh, I've already read all the books, I'm finished. Health is never finished.
Yeah.
And not at all.
It's, I mean, I totally agree with that. It's a whole complex system and you have to do, but sometimes we're looking for root causes. And what I like is that this is something, another piece that maybe we haven't looked at that we have available to add to our arsenal. So when people want to get the functional test, just sort of walk us through how this goes with the
Sure.
testing.
So it's really, so the functional testing is really straightforward. Oh, so the genetics testing is really straightforward. What I do, if they want to work with me specifically, I run a 2-swab 5-panel test, and there's 5 panels. One is the Achieve Your Natural Weight, which looks at all those 15 inflammatory genes, 3 free radical scavenging genes, 8 liver detox genes, 12 methylation genes, 8 cardiovascular, and 16 fat and energy metabolism. And I use it to assess to help them achieve their natural weight. A lot of people have inflammatory weight gain as opposed to caloric weight gain. You can use it same to identify and look at the bone density issues that people may be concerned about. I define the ideal diet profile, which is identifying the carb tolerance. And that's, are you a keto, paleo, Mediterranean, or high carb? Trigger foods. So it's looking at your genetic relationship with gluten, lactose, caffeine, salt, alcohol, histamines, and general food reactivity. So for me, that test, I realized that I was genetically vulnerable to caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. Caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. So that's a thing. I didn't care how bulletproof my coffee was, how much coconut oil is jamming into that coffee. I was an anxious, jittery mess, 30 minutes to 120 minutes later. And I was just in denial about it. And then I saw my genetic test. I was really vulnerable to it. It made total sense. So then the other gene profiles, the vitamin D profiles, looking in detail at those 11 genes and specifically what can be done. And then the last profile, very relevant to today's pandemic times, is the immunity support genes, looking at what genes that we need to support from lifestyle, diet, nutrition, et cetera, to help improve your immune system. So it's pretty straightforward. If people get my ebook, there's a link in the back to schedule a 15-minute chat with me. And if you're wanting to do your genetics, then we can run the genetics. It's as simple as doing a simple cheek swab and just mailing it off to the lab. I get the results back. I analyze them, put together an entire personalized program. And then we talk about the report of findings and exactly what to do based on your genes. And these recommendations are for life. Your genes don't change. And so this particular test never has to be redone. So the investment is once and, amortized over 20, 30, 40 years. It's so worth it.
Great. Well, I can't. So takeaways are that there's a whole nother aspect that most people, I would say a lot of people do not do, or even knew that there's a possibility to find out more information, not something typically ordered. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, there's a lot. Genes are very complicated in one sense, but they also simplify and focus what we need to do in another. There's many different, when people do genetics with me, they get a whole buffet of meaningful, actionable things to do for the long term for all sorts of issues that they may or may not have been aware of, bone density being one of them. And then you've got the plan laid out for life. Now, there's, just to be clear, genetics testing is powerful and amazing, but it is not the same as functional testing. Functional testing is with a thumbprint of what's going on in your body now. Adrenals levels now, gut infections now, the state of your mitochondria now, what's going on with what's your current vitamin D levels now. That's not the same as the genes. So I'm just putting in a little bookmark there for people that functional testing is separate yet related to genetics testing. Ideally, you do both to see what your genes are and then what's going on in your system right now in the moment.
Oh, well, this has been great. And what I like about this is it gives you a direction because, even if something hasn't manifested yet, what you're more susceptible to. And if you have this information, you can be proactive and prevent things. And I just think it's so exciting that we have this ability, because it's in our genes doesn't mean, oh, that's it, you're doomed. It's just the opposite. We can be proactive and there's so much that we can do. So we'll have all the links to your ebook, which really gives people, it's really excellent. And it really gives people a great understanding of this in more detail. And any last minute things you want to leave everybody with? This has been just so interesting.
If people look, I encourage people to approach bone density and bone health from a 30,000 foot view. It is not chasing a special supplement. It's not even doing a special, exercise. It's all those things are tactics. The strategy, the big picture strategy is use testing, use professionals to evaluate your entire lifestyle to see what's going on right now that you can do and change, because that's going to have meaningful impact over years to come, and not rely on chasing a magic bullet. Magic bullets are great, but they have to be put in context of your entire lifestyle, your physiology, and your health goals. That's what I did. I was chasing magic bullets for years, and I wasted a huge amount of time, money, and energy, and a lot of heartache and headache until I found a comprehensive system, and more importantly, found the comprehensive system using testing to clarify the direction to go specific to my needs.
Oh, that's great. And the best part is it's not just for your bones. When you do things that help your bones, everything gets better. So there's such a win-win. Well, I can't thank you enough. And I'll have all the links to all your great information. And you really added another piece to this puzzle because we are looking at it, just like you said, many, many different facets, but we need to know what they are so we can really make the best judgments and really do whatever we can for optimal bone health. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Margie. Really, really, really happy you're doing this. Someone who's had family members with really bad bone density issues, I'm really glad you're kind of taking the reins on this and educating the public on holistic approaches to bone health. It's really needed. And sadly, it's a growth industry. You're going to have a lot more people as the population ages more and more. Your work's going to become even more and more relevant. And I'm so happy you're doing this just from personal family experience. So thank you.
Thanks for all your work as well. You're doing a lot to help so many people. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Sam and have a better understanding of what functional genetics is and how we can use the information gained in these tests to really improve our bones and overall health. Dr. Sam has a great ebook that delves into this in more detail, and the link for that will be in the show notes, as well as the video I talked about that I'm showing you, the exercise Dr. Sam mentioned called Pump Pump that you can do throughout your day. So bye for now, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.